You didn't choose to awaken. I know. That might sound strange to hear. Maybe you thought it was your spiritual quest, your books, your meditations, your conscious journey that brought you here. But the truth is, it's far more unsettling. And at the same time, and far more liberating than you can imagine, there's a specific moment, a precise instant, when something inside you decides that the time has come. And that moment doesn't come from your ego. It doesn't come from your thinking mind. It doesn't come from your conscious will. It comes from something much deeper, something that Eckhart Tolle has spent years studying, and that modern psychology is only just beginning to understand. If you're watching this video, if these words are resonating within you, that's already evidence that this moment has happened, but you might not know when it was. You might not know how it was, and what I'm about to reveal in the next few minutes will completely change how you understand your own journey. Eckhart Tolle tells a story that has transformed millions of lives around the world. For many years, he lived in a state of almost unbearable anxiety and depression. His mental activity was predominantly negative, and his sense of identity was also negative, although he tried to prove his worth through academic success. Even after achieving that success, the happiness lasted only 2 or 3 weeks, and then the depression and anxiety would return. He was trapped in an endless cycle, completely identified with his painful thoughts and emotions. And then came the night that changed everything. Tolle was lying in bed, unable to sleep, tormented by terrible thoughts. And then a thought arose that would be the trigger for his transformation. I can't live with myself anymore. Pause and think about that phrase for a moment. I can't live with myself anymore. Something inside him observed that thought and asked a question. What does that mean, I can't live with myself? Who is the I, and who is the myself that I can't live with? In that instant, something extraordinary happened. There was a disidentification from that unpleasant dream of painful thoughts and emotions. The nightmare became unbearable, and this triggered the separation of consciousness from its identification with form. He awoke and suddenly perceived himself as the I am, and that was deeply peaceful. Tolle describes that the next morning. He woke up and everything seemed fresh, new, miraculous. He walked through the city, and everything seemed to be alive in a way he had never noticed before. The trees, the birds, the people passing by, everything radiated a silent presence. He spent months sitting on park benches, simply observing, simply being, to the outside world. He looked like a homeless person, but internally, he was experiencing something that billions of people will never know. And here's the crucial detail that most people miss. Tolle didn't do anything to cause this. He didn't practice a special technique. He didn't follow a specific ritual. The moment simply arrived because the internal conditions were ready, even though externally everything seemed like a collapse. But here's what no one tells you about that moment. Tolle didn't choose to have that insight. He didn't consciously decide to ask that question. He didn't plan his enlightenment. The moment simply arrived. Something bigger than your conscious mind determined that the time had come. And scientific research is confirming this in surprising ways. A study published in the journal Frontiers in Psychology analyzed 161 accounts of awakening experiences. What the researchers discovered challenges everything we thought we knew about spirituality. Most of these awakening experiences occurred outside the context of spiritual or religious traditions. They weren't induced by spiritual practices like meditation or prayer. Most occurred spontaneously. The researchers called them spontaneous awakening experiences. That's revolutionary. It means you don't need years of meditation. You don't need a spiritual teacher. You don't need a specific religion. Awakening can simply happen, and most of the time, it happens when we least expect it. But if it's not spiritual practice that causes awakening, what is it then? The researchers found a common pattern in almost every case: prolonged psychological turmoil or trauma, intense pain, deep suffering, the feeling that you can't go on like this anymore. These are the real triggers, and that leads us to the central question of this video. Why does your soul choose moments of intense suffering to awaken? The answer lies in something that Tolle calls the dark night of the soul. He describes this as a collapse of perceived meaning in life, an eruption of a deep sense of meaninglessness. Nothing makes sense anymore, there's no purpose to anything. Sometimes it's triggered by some external event, a disaster, the death of someone close, or when the meaning you gave to your life, your activities, your achievements, and simply collapses. And here's the revelation that changes everything. The dark night of the soul is not an obstacle to awakening. It's the very mechanism of awakening. Tolle explains that the dark night of the soul is a kind of death. What dies is the egoic sense of self. Of course, death is always painful, but nothing real has died, just an illusory identity, frequently. It's part of the awakening process, the death of the old self, and the birth of the true self. And it's exactly here that your soul comes into play, because when suffering reaches an unbearable point, when the ego is completely exhausted from its own stories, when there's no escape strategy left, something inside you says, now. It's not the ego that says that. The ego wants to continue existing at any cost. It's something deeper, something that has always been there, patiently waiting for the right moment. Tolle often assures his listeners of something profound. Our interest in the teachings he shares is all the proof we need that a deep shift in consciousness is already underway within us. Read that sentence again if you're watching this video. If you're seeking to understand your own experience, that's already evidence that awakening has begun. You're not seeking. You're responding to something that has already happened, and the researchers confirm this. They found that spontaneous awakenings can lead to profound therapeutic benefits in the short and long term. The study challenges the standard pathologization of spontaneous awakening experiences. That means that what psychiatrists often diagnose as a crisis, as a breakdown, as an illness, may actually be the beginning of a profound transformation. The pain isn't the problem. The pain is the portal. And that raises a disturbing question about how our society treats people undergoing a spiritual transformation. How many people have been medicated during what was actually an awakening? How many have been institutionalized when they were simply going through the dark night of the soul? How many have had their process interrupted because the medical system doesn't understand the difference between pathological breakdown and conscious transformation? Researchers have drawn parallels between spiritual awakenings and conditions like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Both psychiatrists and transpersonal psychologists have tried to separate these sets of experiences. But the reality is, they often get muddled, and the cost of mistaking one for the other can be devastating. If you're going through something intense right now, if you're wondering if you're going crazy or awakening, take it seriously. Seek out professionals who understand the difference. Don't let them label your transformation as an illness. But why you specifically? Why do some people go through their entire lives without awakening, while others are shook out of their sleep by crises that seem so unfair? The answer lies in something that goes beyond conventional psychology. Some souls, for reasons we may never fully comprehend, carry a greater sensitivity, a more finely tuned antenna to the suffering of the world and of themselves. And that sensitivity, which often feels like a curse during the life before awakening, is actually what allows the awakening to happen. It's as if your soul knew, even before you were born, that this would be the moment, and it created the perfect conditions, however painful they may be, so that this moment could happen. But here, I need to pause and clarify something important, because this can be easily misinterpreted. I'm not saying you should seek out suffering. I'm not saying that pain is necessary for awakening. I'm saying that if you've already gone through intense suffering, and if something inside you has shifted after that, then you understand exactly what I'm talking about. Awakening doesn't require suffering, but for most people, suffering is what finally breaks the identification with the ego. It's what creates the opening. It's what makes the thinking mind release its grip, long enough for something larger to emerge. And here's the paradox. Once you awaken, you realize that the suffering was optional all along. But you needed the suffering to realize that the suffering was optional. It's a seemingly impossible circle. That only makes sense after you go through it. Eckhart Tolle describes this vividly in his own story. Before his awakening, he tried to prove his worth through hard work and academic success. But even after achieving that success, the happiness was temporary. The ego is never satisfied. There's always more to conquer, more to prove, more to worry about. And then, in a single night, it all crumbled. Not because he planned it, not because he meditated enough, but because the suffering reached a point where the continuation of identification with the ego became impossible. Remember when I mentioned that Eckhart Tolle asked a crucial question that night: who is the I, and who is the me that I can't live with? That question wasn't asked by the ego. The ego never questions itself in that way. That question came from something deeper, from the observing consciousness that had always been there, but was obscured by incessant mental activity. And that's exactly what happens in the moment of awakening. It's not that you gain something new, it's that you finally realize what's always been there. The consciousness that you are, not the consciousness that you have. And this leads us to a fascinating discovery from modern neuroscience. Researchers in 2024 published studies showing that consciousness isn't simply switched on or off, like a light switch. It exists on a continuum of different states, involving different types of brain functioning. This means that awakening isn't a one-time event. It's a gradual shift along that continuum. But there are specific moments, inflection points, where the shift accelerates dramatically. And those moments, those turning points, are exactly what we call the moment when the soul decides to awaken. One fascinating study examined 54 scientists and academics who had spiritually transformative experiences. Participants reported the experience as mystical, involving feelings of expansion, energy rising up the spine, a sensation of being enveloped in light, love, or part of a unified energy field. Notice that these people weren't traditional mystics. They were scientists, academics, people trained in rational thought and skepticism, and yet the experience found them, not because they sought it in a specific way, but because the conditions were right. And what these scientists reported is fascinating. Many described the experience as the most real thing they'd ever lived, more real than any experiment they conducted, more real than any theory they studied. It was as if their entire previous life had been a dream, and they finally woke up. One participant described feeling an electric energy surging up their spine, culminating in an explosion of light at the top of their head. Another reported a complete dissolution of the boundaries between themselves and the universe. There was no longer inside and outsider, just an infinite vastness of consciousness. And all of them, without exception, said that they didn't choose to have this experience. It simply happened. Like lightning striking you when you're walking along, carefree, unexpected, unsolicited, and absolutely transformative. And here is something I need you to understand deeply. You might be in the middle of this process, right now, without even realizing it. Many people report feeling lost, confused, like they're between two worlds. The old self they knew seems to be dying, but the new self hasn't been fully born yet. This in-between state, this existential limbo, is often the dark night of the soul that Eckhart Tolle describes, and the natural reaction is to resist, to try to go back to what it was before, to desperately seek some meaning, some structure, some familiar identity. But that resistance only prolongs the process. Tolle teaches that people have been through this, and there is a possibility of emerging in a transformed state of consciousness. Life has meaning again, but it is no longer a conceptual meaning that you can necessarily explain. They awaken to something deeper, which is no longer based on concepts in the mind, a deeper sense of purpose or connection to a larger life. It's a kind of rebirth. And here's something that Eckhart Tolle emphasizes repeatedly. This rebirth isn't a one-time experience. It's an ongoing process of death and renewal. Each time you get lost in mental identification and then return to presence, you're experiencing a mini version of this cycle. Every time the ego takes over, and then you realize it. You're dying and being reborn again over time. These cycles become faster. The identification with the mind lasts less time. The return to presence happens more easily. And eventually, for some people, there comes a point where presence becomes the natural state, and identification with the mind becomes the exception. But this takes time, and patience, and above all, the understanding that you are not in control of the timing. Your soul knows. Your ego doesn't need to know. And now I need to share with you the signs that this moment is happening, or has already happened, because many people don't recognize awakening while it's happening. They only understand it retrospectively. First sign. You feel disconnected from your old life in a way you can't explain. Things that used to excite you now seem empty. Relationships that once felt normal now seem superficial. It's not depression exactly. It's more like you're seeing through something that once seemed solid. Second sign. You have moments of unexplainable clarity, followed by intense confusion. One moment, everything makes sense in a profound way. The next, you're wondering if you're losing your mind. This oscillation isn't a problem. It's the integration process happening. Third sign. You feel a magnetic attraction to content like this. Not because you're looking for entertainment, but because something within you recognizes the truth being spoken. As Tolle says, if these words are making sense to you, it means awakening has already begun. Fourth sign. You've experienced a breakdown or collapse event that seemed to destroy everything. Maybe it was a divorce, a job loss, an illness, the loss of a loved one, or simply an internal collapse with no apparent cause. This event, however painful it was the moment your soul said, now. Fifth sign. You feel simultaneously more sensitive and stronger than before. The sensitivity comes from the thinner veil between you and reality. The strength comes from something that doesn't depend on external circumstances. If you recognize 3 or more of these signs, I need you to know something. You're not imagining things, and you're not being dramatic, and you're definitely not losing your mind. You're in the middle of a transformation that billions of people will never experience. But here comes the part that few understand, and that changes everything about how you live the next months and years of your life. The moment your soul decides to awaken is not the end. It's just the beginning. It's like being born. Birth is a moment, but living is an ongoing process. Many people get frustrated because they had a moment of clarity, an awakening experience, and then they seem to go back to normal. They wonder if it was real, if they imagined it all, if they lost something precious. But Tolle clarifies this. Awakening isn't a state you reach and maintain permanently. In the beginning, it may be more like glimpses, moments of presence, followed by long periods of identification with the mind, and that's perfectly normal. What changes is that now you know there's something beyond. You've experienced, even if briefly, the space of consciousness that exists underneath the thoughts, and once you know, you can't unknow it. And this is where most people go wrong. They try to recreate the awakening experience. They try to force that state of clarity. They try to meditate more, read more, practice more. But awakening doesn't come from doing more. It comes from being more. And being isn't something you do, it's something you allow. And now I need to share something about this channel and the community we're building here. For years, I've been sharing these teachings because I know there are people like you going through the dark night of the soul, wondering if they'll survive, needing to hear that there's light on the other side. When you click the super thanks, it's not just a financial contribution. It's you saying, I recognize the importance of this work. You're joining a community of souls who have chosen to awaken. Even when the world around them doesn't understand, it's not payment, it's positioning. It's you declaring that deep truths deserve to be shared, even if they're not popular, even if they don't follow the conventional narrative. Now let me share the practical application of all of this, because understanding isn't enough. You need to know how to navigate this process. First, practice. Stop trying to control the awakening. Your soul has already decided. The process has already begun. Your task isn't to accelerate or direct it. It's simply to allow it. When resistance arises, and it will arise, observe it without fighting it. Second, practice. Honor your dark night. If you're going through a period of meaninglessness, of confusion, of the collapse of what you thought was your life, don't try to escape. That's the work happening. Each moment of discomfort is the old self releasing its grip. Third, practice. Find anchors of presence. They can be moments of silence, connection with nature, conscious breathing, not to escape the process, but to create small islands of stability while the transformation happens around you. Fourth, practice. Trust the timing. Your soul knows what it's doing, even when your mind doesn't understand. The delays that seem frustrating may be exactly the time needed for integration to happen. The rush comes from the ego. The patience comes from the soul. Fifth, practice. Connect with others who are going through the same thing. The dark night of the soul can be incredibly lonely. Knowing that others are on the same path, even if you never meet them in person, can be profoundly comforting. And now, I want to end with something that Tolle shares, and that summarizes everything we've discussed. He says that realizing you are not your thoughts is when you begin to awaken spiritually. Awakening is stepping back and experiencing the self that exists without needing to label, judge, or cling. That moment of perception, that instant when you see the thoughts instead of being the thoughts, that's the moment your soul decides to awaken. And once that happens, there's no going back. You may forget temporarily. You may get lost again in the mind for days, weeks, even months. But the seed has been planted, and that seed will continue to grow, no matter what happens on the surface of your life. You didn't choose to awaken, but something within you, something wiser than your conscious mind, something more patient than your ego, something vaster than your constructed identity, that something chose, and that choice is irrevocable. And perhaps the most liberating thing of all is realizing that you don't need to do anything to deserve this. Awakening isn't a reward for good behavior. It's not a prize for diligent spiritual practices. It's grace, a gift that existence offers to certain souls at certain times. And you were chosen to receive it, not because you're special in the egoic sense, but because you're part of something larger that's happening in human consciousness. A shift that is gaining momentum. And you, watching this video right now, you are part of that shift. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me, when do you think your soul decided it was time? Was it a specific moment of crisis, a gradual breakdown, or maybe you're still in the middle of the process, without even realizing it? Share your experience. I read all the comments in the first 2 hours, and I respond personally. And remember, sharing your story might be exactly what another soul needed to hear, to have the courage to continue. If this video touched something deep inside you, if you felt that recognition that goes beyond words, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. More videos like this are coming. truths that transform, insights that liberate. Until the next video. And remember, you didn't choose to awaken, you were chosen. And that changes absolutely everything.